The Empress of the Valdari Dominion pressed her claws against the council table hard enough to leave grooves in the ancient wood. "You will accept the human delegate," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 3,000 years of unbroken dynasty, "or you will explain to me why the Dominion should continue to feed your province." High Counselor Eshkan's silver scales rippled with barely contained outrage. "Your Imperial Majesty, the creature species has been spacefaring for less than 2 centuries. They are infants. To house one within the sacred halls of the decision is made." Empress Lyth'ara Valdominari rose from her throne, and every Valdari in the chamber dropped their gaze. At 7 feet tall, with iridescent scales that shifted from deep violet to midnight black, she was the physical embodiment of her people's genetic perfection. The ceremonial horns crowning her head marked her as the 63rd unbroken ruler of the Dominion. She was also, at 412 years old, unmated, unchosen, a source of whispered concern in every corner of her empire. "The human arrives within the hour," she continued. "You will treat him with the courtesy afforded to any diplomatic representative. Am I understood?" The council murmured their assent, though Lyth'ara could taste their displeasure in the air. A bitter, acidic undertone to the chamber's carefully regulated atmosphere. She swept from the room before any could see the tremor in her hands. Marcus Webb had learned long ago that the universe didn't care about your plans. He planned to be a teacher. Then the colony ship Meridian had been attacked by raiders, and he'd spent 3 years in a labor camp on Nexus 7. He'd planned to return to Earth after the liberation. Then the diplomatic corps had reviewed his file, his languages, his patience, his peculiar talent for making aliens feel comfortable, and requested his service. Now he stood in the gleaming antechamber of the Valdari Imperial Palace, wearing a formal suit that cost more than his childhood home, waiting to meet the ruler of a species that considered humans barely above livestock. "The Empress will see you now," announced a Valdari servant, her tone suggesting she'd rather announce a waste disposal malfunction. Marcus nodded, adjusted his collar, and stepped through the towering doors. The throne room was designed to intimidate. Columns of dark crystal rose toward a ceiling lost in shadow. Bioluminescent patterns pulsed along the walls in rhythms that felt almost hypnotic. And at the far end, on a throne carved from a single piece of obsidian, sat the Empress. She was beautiful, in the way a storm was beautiful, terrifying, magnificent, utterly beyond human scale. Marcus walked the length of the room, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. He stopped at the prescribed distance and bowed, not the full prostration demanded of Valdari subjects, but the dignified inclination of a sovereign representative. "Your Imperial Majesty," he said. "I am Marcus Webb, cultural attaché from the United Earth Alliance. I thank you for your hospitality." The Empress studied him with eyes like molten gold. And then something strange happened. Her nostrils flared. Her pupils dilated. The scales along her neck flushed from violet to a deep, pulsing crimson. "Leave us," she commanded, her voice suddenly hoarse. "Everyone, now." The servants and guards exchanged confused glances, but they obeyed. Within moments, the massive doors sealed shut, leaving Marcus alone with the most powerful being in the sector. The Empress rose from her throne, her movements suddenly unsteady. "What?" Marcus began. "Do not speak." She descended the steps, each footfall seeming to cost her tremendous effort. "Do not move." She circled him like a predator circling prey, but there was something desperate in her movements, something almost frightened. Her breathing had grown ragged. Her claws extended and retracted involuntarily. "Your scent," she whispered, stopping directly in front of him. "What is your scent?" Marcus swallowed. I showered this morning. Standard soap. I didn't use any, no." She leaned closer, and he could feel the heat radiating from her scales, not artificial. "You... what? Your chemistry. Your pheromones. Your..." She staggered backward, pressing a hand to her temple. "Your Majesty, are you unwell? Should I call someone?" "No." The word was almost a snarl. "No one can know. No one can see me like this." She looked at him with an expression he never expected to see on the face of an empress. Raw, unguarded fear. "Do you understand? My scent drives her species into a frenzy. She locked herself in my room for 3 days. That is what they will say. That is the story they will tell. The Empress, undone by a human's presence. I don't understand." "Of course you don't." She laughed, and there was no humor in it. "Your species knows nothing of the Valdari bonding response. Nothing of how our bodies choose our mates. Nothing of the chemical triggers that have governed our reproduction for millennia." She met his eyes, and in that moment, the Empress was gone. There was only Lyth'ara, a woman caught in the grip of something she couldn't control. "Your biochemistry," she said quietly, is triggering every mating instinct I possess. And if anyone sees me like this, if anyone knows, I will be declared unfit. They will take my throne. Everything I have built, everything I have sacrificed, will be destroyed. Marcus stood very still. What do you need me to do? The guest quarters assigned to Marcus were in the eastern wing of the palace, far from the throne room, far from the council chambers, far from any prying eyes. They made it there through service corridors, the Empress leaning against him more than she would ever admit, her scales burning hot against his arm. By the time they reached the door, she was trembling. Inside, she managed. Now. He helped her through the door, and she immediately pulled away, putting distance between them. Her back pressed against the far wall, her claws leaving marks in the stone. I will manage this, she said, more to herself than to him. I simply need time. A few hours. The response will fade. It didn't fade. 3 hours later, the Empress had not left. She sat in the corner of Marcus's room, her arms wrapped around her knees, her scales cycling through colors he couldn't name. You should eat something, Marcus said quietly. He'd placed a tray of food near her an hour ago. It remained untouched. The hunger is not for food, I know. He sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining distance. But your body still needs fuel. Whatever's happening to you, starvation won't help. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since they'd entered the room. Why are you not afraid? I spent 3 years in an ex-in labor camp, Marcus said simply. I learned the difference between someone who wants to hurt me and someone who's hurting. Something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps? Or something deeper? You were a prisoner? I was. But you carry yourself with such... She struggled for the word, dignity. As if you have not been broken. I was broken, Marcus said, several times actually. But broken things can be put back together. Sometimes they're even stronger for it. The Empress was silent for a long moment. Then slowly, she reached for the tray of food. By the second day, the palace was in an uproar. The Empress is indisposed, announced her first attendant, a rigid Valdari named Velshen who had served 3 generations of rulers. She is conducting private negotiations with the human delegate. She is not to be disturbed. High Counselor Reshkan's scales flared with barely contained fury. Private negotiations? For over a day? This is unseemly. This is the will of Her Imperial Majesty, Velshen interrupted smoothly. Unless you wish to question the Empress's judgment before the full council. Reshkan did not. Inside the room, Lyth'ara had begun to talk. It started as fragments, muttered explanations of Valdari bonding chemistry, clinical descriptions of hormonal cascades and neurological responses. But as the hours passed, and her body slowly adjusted to Marcus's presence, the words became something else. Stories. Memories. Truths she had never spoken aloud. I was not supposed to rule, she said on the second evening. She sat on the floor now, her back against the bed, closer to Marcus than she had allowed herself to be. My elder sister Lyth'ara was the heir. I was merely the spare, the insurance, in case of accident or assassination. What happened to her? She died. Lyth'ara's voice was flat, carefully controlled, a hunting accident they called it. She was 16 years old. I was 12. I'm sorry. Are you? She tilted her head, studying him. Most would say it was fortunate. The throne came to me. Power. Authority. Everything a Valdari could desire. And is that what you desired? The question hung in the air. No one had ever asked her that, not once in 400 years. I desired my sister, she said finally. I desired to be invisible, unremarkable, free. I desired to make my own choices, to fail at things, to be imperfect without an empire, watching my every stumble. Marcus nodded slowly. The camp I was in, there was this older man. Jakob Dite. He'd been a professor before the raiders took him. History, I think. He used to say that the heaviest chains are the ones we can't see, the obligations we inherit, the roles we never chose. Your Jakob was wise. He died in the 3rd year. Fever. There was medicine, but the guards wouldn't waste it on an old human. Marcus's voice remained steady, but something tightened around his eyes. I held his hand while he went. He kept apologizing to me, for not being strong enough to see the liberation. Lyth'ara watched him in silence. Then, very slowly, she extended one clawed hand toward him. Marcus looked at the hand. At the razor-sharp claws, the scales that could deflect a blade, the raw power contained in that elegant limb. He took it. Her scales were cooler now, no longer burning with the fever of the bonding response. But the touch itself seemed to ignite something else, a charge that had nothing to do with chemistry. You are strange, she murmured. You should fear me. Your species fears everything. My species survives everything, Marcus corrected gently. There's a difference. On the third day, Lyth'ara finally slept. She had fought it for hours, terrified of what vulnerability might mean in the presence of another being. But exhaustion eventually claimed her, and she drifted off sitting upright against the wall, her head slowly tilting until it came to rest against Marcus's shoulder. He didn't move. For 3 hours, he sat perfectly still, barely breathing, as the Empress of the Valdari Dominion slept against him like a child seeking comfort from a storm. When she woke, her eyes immediately found his. You stayed, she said. Where else would I go? She sat up slowly, creating distance between them again. But, this time, the distance felt different. Chosen, rather than necessary. The bonding response has stabilized, she said, her tone carefully neutral. My chemistry has adapted to your presence. I no longer feel the overwhelming compulsion. That's good. Yes. She rose, smoothing her scales with practiced dignity. I will return to my duties. This incident will be explained as intensive diplomatic negotiations. No one will know the truth. Marcus stood as well, and what is the truth? Lyth'ara paused at the door. Her back was to him, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her claws curled against the frame. The truth, she said quietly, is that I have been Empress for 400 years. I have commanded fleets, crushed rebellions, negotiated treaties that shaped the fate of civilizations. But until 3 days ago, no one had ever simply sat with me. No one had ever let me speak without calculation, without agenda, without fear. Lyth'ara, Empress, she corrected, but her voice was gentle. You must call me Empress in public, for both our sakes. And in private? She turned, and for just a moment, the mask slipped. Beneath the scales and the horns and the weight of empire, there was simply a woman who had been alone for a very long time. In private, she said, we shall see. The weeks that followed were a careful dance. In public, Marcus performed his role as cultural attaché with perfect diplomacy. He attended functions, translated customs, smoothed over the endless misunderstandings between Valdari formality and human directness. He was polite, professional, and utterly unremarkable. In private, he dined with the Empress twice a week. A diplomatic initiative, Lyth'ara explained to her council. The human provides insight into his species' psychology. It is valuable intelligence. High Counselor Reshkin didn't believe it for a moment. His spies reported that the Empress laughed during these dinners, that she spoke of topics unrelated to governance, that she had, on one occasion, shown the human her private collection of ancient star maps. He began to plot. Tell me about your bonding customs, Marcus asked one evening. They sat in Lyth'ara's private study, surrounded by shelves of crystal data slates and the soft glow of bioluminescent lamps. The initial response I triggered, is that normal? Normal? Lyth'ara's laugh was bitter. Nothing about that was normal. The bonding response is meant to activate when we encounter a compatible mate of our own species. Specific pheromone combinations, genetic markers, psychological compatibility, all must align. The chances of any single Valdari triggering another's response are perhaps 1 in 100,000. And I triggered yours. You did. She looked away. It should be impossible. Your biochemistry is entirely alien. There is no logical explanation. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Does there need to be one? Of course there does. I am the Empress. Every action I take, every decision, every relationship, all must be justified, explained, defended. If my council discovered that I was... She stopped. Was what? She met his eyes, was developing feelings for a creature most of my people consider barely sapient. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Lyth'ara, Marcus said gently. I spent 3 years being told I was worthless. Less than worthless, a tool, a resource, a thing to be used and discarded. I know what it's like to have others define your value. He leaned forward. But I also know that what they think doesn't change who you are. It doesn't change what you feel. And what do I feel? I think you're asking the wrong person. Her scales flushed and she looked away again. But this time, there was something almost like a smile on her face. The assassination attempt came 3 weeks later. Reshkan had been patient. He gathered allies, secured loyalties, waited for the perfect moment. When the Empress's personal guards were rotated, when the surveillance systems experienced a convenient malfunction, when the human attaché was alone in his quarters, Marcus woke to the sound of his door being forced open. 3 Valdari warriors entered, their scales painted in shadow patterns that marked them as assassins. They moved with predatory grace, their claws extended, their intentions clear. The Empress's pet, one hissed. How unfortunate that you wandered into a restricted area and were killed by automated defenses. Marcus rose slowly from his bed. He was unarmed, outmatched, facing creatures twice his size with natural weapons that could disembowel him in seconds. He'd been in worse situations. Before you kill me, he said calmly, consider this. The Empress will investigate. She will find evidence. And when she does, your master will not be able to protect you. Our master is the power now, the lead assassin replied. By morning, the Empress will be removed. Her unnatural attachment to a human is proof of her unfitness. The council has already been convinced. Then why kill me in secret? Marcus asked. Why not simply arrest me? Present me as evidence? The assassin hesitated. Because, Marcus continued, you're not certain. You're not certain the council will actually move against her. You're not certain your coup will succeed. You're hedging your bets, eliminating the evidence so you can deny involvement if things go wrong. Clever for a human. I've had practice. The door behind the assassins exploded inward. Lyth'ara stood in the wreckage, her scales blazing crimson, her eyes burning with a fury that transcended language. Behind her, a dozen Imperial Guard leveled weapons at the assassins. You were saying, she said softly, something about removing me? The coup collapsed within hours. Reshkan was arrested along with his conspirators. The council, faced with irrefutable evidence of treason, fell over themselves to reaffirm their loyalty. By dawn, the Empress's authority was stronger than ever. But Marcus found her afterward, alone in her study, staring at nothing. You're not celebrating, he observed. I knew, she said quietly. I knew Reshkan was plotting. I have known for months. I was waiting for him to expose himself, to give me the evidence I needed to remove him without creating a power vacuum. She looked at Marcus with something like shame. I used you as bait. I knew he would target you to hurt me, and I allowed it. I calculated the risks and found them acceptable. Marcus sat beside her. Did you? I sent the guards the moment I heard the door breach. I ran. I have not run in 200 years, but I ran. That doesn't sound very calculated. No, Dot. Her voice was barely a whisper. It does not. She turned to him, and there were tears on her face, Valdari tears, iridescent and strange, but tears nonetheless. I could have lost you, she said. I could have lost you to my own schemes, my own calculations, and I would have deserved it. I would have deserved to be alone again, because Marcus kissed her. It was gentle, careful, a question rather than a statement. Her scales were warm against his skin, her lips softer than he expected, her taste like copper and lightning. When they parted, she was staring at him with wide eyes. Humans, she said shakily, are very strange creatures. We do what we feel, Marcus replied. Sometimes that's all we have. The announcement rocked the Dominion to its core. The Empress has chosen a mate, Velshan declared to the assembled council. A bonding ceremony will be conducted according to ancient rites, but, someone sputtered. The Empress's bonding response has been confirmed by the Imperial physicians, Velshan continued, her voice allowing no interruption. The human Marcus Webb is, by the laws that have governed Valdari's succession for 3,000 years, her legitimate consort. It was, technically, true. The bonding response could not be faked, and once confirmed, it superseded all other considerations. That the response had been triggered by a human was unprecedented, perhaps even scandalous, but it was also undeniable. The council had no choice but to accept. The ceremony took place on the night of confluence, when all 3 Valdari moons aligned in the sky. Marcus stood in the great temple, dressed in ceremonial robes that felt strange against his skin, surrounded by beings who had despised his species mere months ago. Lyth'ara walked toward him through the crowd, her scales shimmering with every color of the rainbow, her head held high. She wore no crown. The tradition was for Valdari rulers to approach their mates as equals, stripped of all symbols of authority. She stopped before him, and the temple fell silent. Marcus Webb of Earth, she said, her voice carrying through the vast space, I stand before you not as Empress but as Lyth'ara. I offer you my scales, my claws, my name. I offer you my fears and my failures. I offer you 400 years of loneliness and the hope that you might end it. Marcus took her hands in his. Lyth'ara of the Valdari, he replied, the words he'd practiced feeling suddenly inadequate. I stand before you as Marcus. A former prisoner. A former teacher. A man who learned in darkness that light can be found in the most unexpected places. He squeezed her hands gently. I offer you my patience. My presence. My promise that you will never have to face the weight of your empire alone. The binding words were exchanged. The ancient rituals were completed. And when it was done, when the temple erupted in ceremonial chants, Lyth'ara leaned close to Marcus and whispered, "They will write about this for centuries. The Empress who bonded with a human. The scandal of the age." "Let them write," Marcus whispered back. "I'm more interested in what happens next." "What happens next," she said, "is that we rebuild. We redefine. We show this empire that humanity is not a species to be dismissed." A smile played at her lips, "and we face whatever comes together." In the months that followed, things changed. The Valdari Dominion opened formal relations with the United Earth Alliance. Trade routes were established. Cultural exchanges began. Marcus's position evolved from diplomatic attaché to imperial consort, a role with no precedent and no rulebook. He made it up as he went along. He was good at that. One evening, a year after the bonding ceremony, he found Lyth'ara on their private balcony, watching the moons rise over the crystal spires of the capital. "You're thinking again?" he said, joining her. "I'm always thinking. It's exhausting." "What about this time?" She leaned against him, a gesture that had once been impossible, the Empress showing vulnerability, seeking comfort, admitting need. Now it was simply what they did. "I'm thinking about the stories," she said. "The ones they'll tell about us, about how the Empress was undone by a human's presence. How she lost control, locked herself away, emerged bound to an alien creature." She paused. "They'll say I was weak, and what do you say?" She turned to face him, her golden eyes soft in the moonlight. "I say that strength is not the absence of vulnerability. I say that the bravest thing I ever did was let myself need someone. I say that in 400 years of ruling, of conquering, of dominating, I never once felt as powerful as I do standing beside you." Marcus smiled and pulled her close. "The stories will say what they say," he murmured against her scales. "But we know the truth. And what is the truth?" He kissed her forehead, gentle and sure. "That sometimes the best thing that can happen to an empire is for its ruler to remember how to be a person. And sometimes the best thing that can happen to a person is to find someone worth being vulnerable for." Above them, the three moons blazed in perfect alignment, casting light across a galaxy that would never quite be the same.